Yeah, thanks for having me. So this will be pretty fun. So basically, I'm not going to use slides today. I'm going to use a mural board. I do advise mural, so full disclaimer. But I love this online space and being able to collaborate with folks. So I'm not going to use slides today, and then I will hopefully we have time. I can put a link in chat, and you can even like come in and help me with an exercise later on if you want to stick around. So I'm David. I'm out here in, I was in the Bay Area for 10 years during the pandemic. I'm a little further outside the Bay Area, but still inside Northern California. My background is all over the place. I started in startups, and then for the last 10 years or so, I've been advising startups, but also bigger companies in how to test business ideas. And so basically, you're going to get like a behind the scenes view of how I coach and why we wrote the book with Alex Osterwalder. And hopefully, it'll help you look at risk a little differently and give you some options because that's really what we need. I feel like you all are great at this, but we could always use more options as far as testing and being able to frame risk. So I do have a learning goal for us all, which is basically to help you de-risk your product and business ideas, service ideas, being able to kind of look at it and how do we defer building and test our way through this because we don't really want to build something that nobody wants. I did that personally at a couple startups, which is why I'm so passionate about this kind of work. It wasn't fun for me to spend nights and weekends building things that basically people did not care about. And so I want to give you a way to think about that. I wish I'd had some of this material when I was at at least second and third startup. So yeah. And then I do have a code of conduct for all our sessions because this will be interactive, and it's basically the Bill and Ted code of conduct, which is be excellent to one another. So when we do have feedback Q&A or you're in chat, please just be respectful in tone and everything. All right. So where I want to start with is this great framing, and I'll draw a bit for you all, of risk, or at least how I view risk. And I picked this up in design school, but it's really tough to trace the single source of truth for this diagram. I first learned it from like IDEO, and then you pull that thread and it's on Stanford D School site, and then you look at that, and that was the Larry Keeley triangle, and then you look at that and it's Institute of Design Chicago. So I think it goes back decades. However, I find that it just works. No matter what kind of company I'm working with, I don't really focus on a specific sector. So I work in automotive, I work in paint, I work in software as a service, deep sea exploration. Like I've worked on a lot of different things, and I feel like no matter what industry I'm on, or I'm trying to help, this framing really helps. So I'll just kind of give you an overview of it. So because this is going to be a good framing for the rest of our session together. And so first is desirability, which is pretty much like a do they want this kind of question. And so is it desirable? What is the risk around jobs, pains, and gains of the customer, your value proposition, and basically what's the desirability risk with what you're working on. With viability, it's more of a should we do this question. Now, granted, you should have a moral compass in business and make ethical business decisions. And on top of that, it's like, should we do this? Is this a startup? Is this a business? Or is this a hobby? And if you don't have a business model, if it's not viable, you just probably have a very expensive hobby. And so when you think about should we do this, can we do this at a specific price point that will help us sustain? Can we move the needle in some way? And is this a viable thing to work on? And with feasibility, it's more of can we do this? Now, if you look at a lot of other kind of material out there, feasibility is specifically just technically focused, technology focused. I tend to expand beyond that. And so I look at this as, yeah, technically it needs to work and you have some risk there, but it also needs to, not be shut down by regulators and you can't violate patient privacy laws. And so I work with a lot of very risk averse B2B, heavily regulated companies, both startups and big corporations. And so when you're thinking about feasibility risk, yeah, technically it could work, but you're going to be shut down if it violates other regulations. So for example, the first startup I joined, we were transferring about $1 billion a month online in premiums, but we had to clear the money, right? So even though our platform worked here in the United States, we had to work with the DTCC and work with the court on insurance standards. And so, yes, technically we had some risk, but we had also some other risk with regards to regulations and the regulatory bodies. So when you think about this, let's say you just focused on desirability, and viability. So people want this, and you have a model for it, but you can't do it. It's not feasible. Well, unfortunately, you're going to fail, and you're going to fail in a big way, not in a small way. And one of the experiments I see, and I just literally wrote an article about this, which is like crowdfunding, Indiegogo, Kickstarter, anything that's crowdfunding related. Most of those that you see fail because they didn't address feasibility. All right, so they were desirable, people wanted them, and they were viable, people were literally willing to fund them. But in the end, they couldn't figure out, let's say, how to get the firmware and the app and the hardware to all work together. Unfortunately, this happens time and time again because we don't really understand how risk is framed, and we get really excited because people want to give us money, but then we realize, oh, feasibility wise, we didn't address how to do this. I see some more of my corporate clients using crowdfunding now because feasibility is not really a problem for them. It's more like they're worried about people not wanting it after they launch the product. So interesting, over the last, I say 5 years or so, a lot of my corporate clients have been doing lightly branded like crowdfunding campaigns to see, is it desirable, is it viable, because they can handle feasibility. All right, so let's say you focused on desirability and feasibility. So people wanted it and you could build it, but then you forgot viability and there was no revenue model there. Well, unfortunately, that's usually like the products we love that are no longer around. They never had a business model attached to them. They basically just couldn't sustain. And so therefore, it's really frustrating to be in a spot where people want your product and it's feasible to build it, except you just can't really figure out the pricing or you can't make the business model work. And that happens far too often, I'm afraid. And then let's say, well, maybe we focused on feasibility and viability, but we totally forgot about desirability. This still happens somehow. And even out here in Silicon Valley, this still happens where we fund things that nobody cares about. Like, yes, you can build it, and yes, you have a business model if people would actually want it. So it's feasible, it's viable, but it's not desirable in any way. And so that's when you essentially just build something nobody wants. And that's why I'm really passionate about this topic, because I feel like this still happens far too often in the big companies I work with, and also in startups and startup accelerators. I see this too often where we just get excited, we want to create, and I totally get it. We want to build, but we're not building to learn, we're sort of just building to build. And so when you think about the build, measure, learn loop, right, we really need to factor in the learning here. And so ideally, right, you want to focus on all three types of risk. Now, you don't have to focus on all three types of risk at the same time, but basically, you need to be having a frame of reference about how to address this and basically be able to think about all three. So what we've been doing and what Alex Osterwalder has been doing as well, I think the Testing Business Ideas book might be the first book where we implemented this, but Alex and Eve had been drawing about this and talking about this long before we published Testing Business Ideas. So the business model canvas created by my co-author, Alex Osterwalder, has been around forever, right? Like I used it. That's how I got to know Alex, right? I was like, this tool's amazing and it's going to help me with my coaching. And that's how we got connected a long time ago. And so I've been using it a while, and I feel like people keep making mistakes with it, right? They keep treating it like a checklist, like, oh, I have a value prop. Yep, I have this customer segment. And it's not going to give you a lot of value if you just use it as a checklist once and then go about your merry way. So one of the things helping people focus, we've been thinking about, well, how does risk apply to, let's say, your business model? And so this is where we picked up on a lot of the desirable, viable, feasible kind of theming, and it works pretty well. It's not perfect, but I think it works pretty well. So for example, desirability, a lot of your risk around your value prop and your segments and kind of how they interact, there's a lot of desirability risk there. Okay. So when you're sketching out your canvas, you can think through, all right, like probably have some desirability risks that we need to talk about or address. Viability is sort of like these bottom two boxes of the canvas. You have your revenue, which is like the price basically people are willing to pay. And then you have your cost structure, which what is going to cost to create this value and deliver it to your customers. And then feasibility is kind of backstage, right? So it's a lot of your activities. So think verbs, resources, think your nouns. And then who you partner with, a lot of that is going to be backstage feasibility risk. So if you look about this is not a left or right tool. And no matter how many times, maybe it's a Western thing, but here in the United States, people always want to go left or right and everything, right? And I jump around a bit. So, if I'm helping a company fill this out, I might start in customer segments. Like, who's your customer? Who are you serving, right? For what value, right? And then for a value proposition, it's okay, what's the value we create and what's the benefit of the product? Sometimes you can put your product in here, but I've been coaching teams to put, the perceived benefit of your product in here and think of your product more like a resource. And I feel like that's a good mindset shift for a lot of entrepreneurs and innovators I work with. And then, how do you reach them? What are your acquisition distribution channels? And then what are your customer relationships? What's the nature of them? I would say this is probably the hardest box to figure out based on just coaching people on this. Is it automated? Is it in person? Is it ongoing? Is it a one-time? Like, what's the nature of the relationship with your customer? If you notice, this is all desirability. So when I'm starting with teams, there's a good chance a lot of your risk is like right here in desirability. And so when we drop down, we start thinking about viability. So, what are our revenue streams, direct or indirect? And then backstage, we look at activities. So what are the verbs, key verbs that you need to do to make this happen? What are the resources you need? So think physical and digital. Is it patents? Is it literally a factory? What does this cost? And then finally, I touch on who do you partner with? Now, you don't have to follow this flow exactly step by step, but this is the flow I mostly use, I would say 90% of the time. And you'll notice it's like desirability risk, and it dabbles it a bit in viability. And then we say, oh, we have some feasibility risk, and then we have like viability, right? And so if you think of it more like a system, how do you deliver your value to customers? How do you build relationships with them? How do they generate revenue, either directly or indirectly for you, right? And then backstage, you look at your activities and your resources, and you can say, okay, what does this cost? And if I partner with somebody, I'm partnering with them because they bring an activity that I either can't do or don't want to do, or they bring a resource that we don't have or we can't get, or maybe even, and this is pretty common too, they create a channel for us where we can meet. We can basically reach our partners through the channel. Okay, so this happens with a lot of my consumer packaged good companies that I advise. So when you think about it that way, it's like, okay, so this is kind of like your one-page strategy document. We think about risk, and the way I write risk, I love colors. So in the book, unfortunately, we didn't use like these exact colors. We use patterns. But when I'm doing workshops, which is what I mostly do in coaching real companies, I use different colors. So I use orange for desirability. So I start writing these down, these we believe statements, which are basically assumptions, right? And I like we believe because it kind of opens your team up to the fact that they might be willing to test some of this stuff versus these are just requirements, or things that are already true. Down here at the bottom, we have green, which is basically the viability, right? We believe statements. And then backstage, we have blue, which is feasibility, which is the can we statement. So if you look at the overall sort of like theming here, right, you'll notice we talked about desirable, viable, feasible, like these circles, right? And this is how we overlay it on the canvas. Now, granted, you can't really think about these in total isolation because let's say it costs a lot to make your thing, then obviously you have to charge more for it, and that might shrink your market. So they are very much related. But I feel like this helps teams sort of unpack risk, which usually it's just one of these big risks they hit me with, which is like, will they want it or will they buy it? And while that probably keeps you up at night, you need to be able to kind of be more specific and unpack these and be able to map these. So that's what we do next. So basically, we take these. So we take these assumptions that we've written down, and I have this little 2x2 that I used to work with Jeff Gothelf and Josh Seiden, who wrote Lean UX, and they've had some other more recent books too. But they have this great 2x2 in Lean UX, and I was trying to use it. And for whatever reason, with my teams, I was just really struggling with like theming things and the axes and whatnot, and having them choose an experiment. And so I just kept iterating on it forever. And then I finally came up with this thing. I was like, well, it barely looked. I mean, it's a 2x2, but a lot of the similarities are no longer there because I've changed the axes so many times, and we use different colors. But what I like to call is I call it assumptions mapping. So I'll write this down here for you all. So basically, It's this little 2x2 that I've iterated with teams over, oh my gosh, I don't know, at least 7 years at this point. It may be longer. Google uses this now. They reached out to me to include this in their design sprint kit. The federal government uses this. There's all kinds of different people that use this now. And I think they use it because it's a really great way to just focus on risk for a conversation. Because I feel like sometimes we skip that part and we just kind of go build. And so basically what I did is I helped teams, kind of focus where to experiment. And so I used to skip this. And unfortunately, what would happen, they just kind of experiment on stuff that was fun or easy. And that's not where your risk always resides, is stuff that's fun and easy. Usually it's the quite opposite things that you want to neglect. So when you think about it, what we do is we start pulling these over and we say, okay, we believe, right? So there's something around desirability, for example. Well, how important is this to the success of our business? Is it like make or break the whole company important? Or is it like, it's not that important in relation to everything else we're doing? So usually we start, with that level of importance. And then when we can do a whole masterclass on evidence, by the way, we say, well, how much evidence do we have to support this statement? And that's why I like saying we believe statements. I don't write these as questions. I like writing these as statements. And then you could say, well, how much qualitative, quantitative evidence do we have to support this statement? And so as like a rule here, guideline, if you just interviewed, let's say 3 customers, I'd put it over here. If they are actually paying for something, prepaying with it, and they've already given you payment information, it's over here, right? And so it's not a perfect science, but once you start getting one on here, basically, let's say, this is really important desirability, but we also don't have any evidence. Then when I pull the next one over, let's grab a blue one here. I would say, is this more or less important? And do we have more or less evidence? And so once you get one, I find it goes pretty quickly. And so what happens is we start dragging these over and talking about them. So don't forget to talk when you do this. I've had some teams just silently write and then they create a bunch of duplicates. And that's it still works, but it's a little messier because then we have to like dedupe and everything and theme stuff. But basically, if you talk your way through this, you're going to end up with this really interesting map of, okay, what is really important where we don't have a lot of evidence to support. And so the way I use this is, one, we rarely have this conversation with the teams I'm working with. So I like having space for this conversation. And 2, it really helps us focus on where should we be testing. Like I had the pleasure of working with Eric Ries when he wrote Lean Startup, and I helped him on some stuff in the startup way. Some of the teams in there I've coached too. And the way he would frame this is like, oh, this is like your leap of faith, right? Or you could say your riskiest assumption. I think leap of faith, you could go like all the way back to Kierkegaard probably to frame it that way. But basically, I'm trying to get teams to focus on and agree, right? Here are the things that are most important, where we have the least amount of evidence. So if we're going to experiment, let's go after those. It doesn't mean this other stuff, you neglect. But if you're going to experiment, then that's where I would recommend. So far, you'll notice, okay, so we have our 3 themes, right? Desirable, viable, feasible. We overlay them on our canvases, okay? And then we start writing down our assumptions and we start mapping them. Now, from there, I know this sounds really involved, but in practice, I do this quite a bit. It's people pick up on it pretty quickly. So from there, one of the reasons I wrote the book was that we want to start designing experiments that address our risk, okay? So in the book, we have 44 of those. And there are plenty more than 44. That was just, I had to stop writing some point. Initially, I was like, I don't know if I can actually write a book on this. And then I was like, oh no, I already have 200 pages of experiments. I have to stop. But basically, the way we frame these are discovery and validation. And we are building off of like Steve Blank's work, A 4 Steps to Epiphany. He frames this as customer discovery and customer validation. We just wanted to go beyond the customer in a lot of our testing. So when you think about desirable, viable, feasible, that expands just beyond front stage customer. And so we use discovery and validation as a general sense. And basically, we can't go over all 44 today because we just don't have time. But some of you get the book today, so then you can like flip through it. But basically, if you're looking at discovery, From an evidence point of view, where you're trying to go is you're trying to go from some, or actually, let's do it this way. From an evidence point of view, you want to go from like none to some, all right? So you don't even know if there's a problem to be solved. You're trying to understand the jobs, pains, and gains of the customer. So a lot of these are going to be very quick and very cheap, and they're not something you would bet like your whole portfolio on. Like it's basically, it's only going to give you light directional evidence. And I wouldn't, let's say, interview a few customers and then build the entire app or whatever the solution is. But it should give you directional evidence to figure out if you're on the right track whatsoever. With the validation experiments, you're usually a little further along in your journey. And from an evidence point of view, you're trying to go from some evidence to strong evidence. And so in the book, and we've updated things since the book, because the book's 2 years old already, and we're constantly iterating, of course. But basically, from an evidence point of view, we no longer say weak, we say light evidence. And the reason we changed that framing, Alex and I have had conversations about this. People can perceive your experimentation, your evidence you generate is like, oh, that was just weak evidence. Like, why'd you even do that? In reality, that was something that was really valuable to do. it's just qualitative. It's just directional. So it's going to inform what we do next, which we'll display here in a bit. But basically, we've kind of stopped using the framing weak. So if you do pick up the book, we do use the framing of light evidence now instead of weak. So if I zoom in on a bunch of these, I tried to write a book without using the term MVP. I was almost successful. The way I thought I can make it more tangible is like just going down to the types of MVPs I really see with my teams and coaching them. And so one of them is concierge, which is basically you're manually doing things. You're not necessarily have a lot of tech involved. So you're manually like white glove service, delivering value to the customer. The difference between that and let's say like something over here, the Wizard of Oz. A Wizard of Oz, it's not obvious a person is involved. So there's almost like a digital curtain or something, and you're doing it manually behind the scenes, but then you're delivering value and they don't really understand that you're doing it manually. They still may even pay for it, but it's basically, it gets its name from like the book and the movie, right? But basically you're trying to figure things out before you build a bunch. The other types of MVPs I would say would be here we have the single feature MVP. That one's more like I would say like an Amazon Dash button, back in the day where you just press a button and it would order stuff for you. That's a single feature that informed their Alexa strategy. So they discontinued those after they learned what they needed to. But basically, it's something that's like the core thing of your overall value prop. And so I think early days Foursquare is another example where you would just check in. That was kind of the value. And then mashup, I would say out of mashup, this whole like no code movement is really building off of this type of experimentation where I've seen Uber Eats, I've seen Airbnb recreated without code. You just mash up, let's say Airtable and Unbounce and something else. And then before you know it, people are paying for it. I've seen a lot of like really quick bootstrapping that way. And these tools are so advanced now, you can get like 1 to 2 years out of them, where in the past you'd have to like hire a development team and all this stuff. And so I was just on a Clubhouse the other day where this lawyer, she literally like quit her job, and a month later she had learned how to use Bubble and had a platform with paying customers, and she had no idea how to code. So I think it's a really, really fascinating time to be in tech right now, because some of these barriers that were in front of people, there's a learning curve to the tools, right? But you don't have to you don't have to hire developers anymore to get stuff for paying customers. I think it's super cool. In the hardware world, I'm seeing people 3D print. I'm seeing people use existing parts and mashing them together. And you think of like early days Tesla, that was pretty much a mashup. The mule was like a Lotus Elise body, some other parts that they ended up using to create value. So I think it's really interesting what's going on in the industry right now. So what I thought I would do is kind of just give you some of the taxonomy, and then maybe we could do a little exercise together for those of you hanging out here. And I'll paste the link in chat here in a minute, and then we can like experiment with some stuff together, because it's always fun for me. So we had a pretty ambitious project. I do have to say, at times I wondered if we could pull it off. which was I've seen all these experiments. Like I've been a part of the lean startup community for a long time and really giving back and coaching people and trying to help folks build stuff, yeah, or basically test stuff before they build. And I noticed there wasn't like a great way to choose what experiments. Like experiments, you can find them on growth hacker sites, you can find them on blogs, and they're just like lists and lists of stuff. And I felt like people don't need another list of stuff. They needed a way to kind of choose. And that's where we really try to set ourselves apart and provide value to people. And I think it's one of the reasons the book has been so successful. And so what we did is we applied a taxonomy to it. So if you look here, it's like, okay, how much does this cost? And it's not perfect, but is this like free to do? Or is this going to be like tens of thousands of dollars? And so we have these little dots, like the lower, the like single dot is almost free. I think we only have a few dots that are all the way over. I think crowdfunding is one of them because it's kind of expensive once you do the professional video, you drive people to it and you have the perks and everything. But most of the experiments I have to say in the book are pretty cheap, especially in relation to like building the whole thing. We also have these things of time, right? So setup and runtime. And I used to have these as one, and then I realized, well, some of these experiments, it might take a long time to set up, but then you don't run them very long. Or you might set them up really quickly and you run them for a while. And so we tried to basically give guidance on, well, how much is it going to take to set up and run? And then probably the biggest thing that people were still are wondering about a little bit is like evidence strength. Is this going to produce strong evidence or light evidence based on what we do? So you think of like even something like a landing page. If you're collecting email, which is great, uh, that's pretty light evidence because people give up their email for everything. But let's say you're collecting payment information, that's stronger evidence because they're literally giving you payment information for something that they want, you know? And so I do think we need to work on this with overall as a community. I feel like we need much more content around this. This is part of our masterclass that we do publicly as well. But basically, try to help people think through, oh, wait, I shouldn't be really confident about this because it's light evidence. It doesn't mean I give up, but it means I need to use that to inform my next experiment to get better evidence. And I think that iteration is still something we're struggling with. It isn't a I run one experiment and then I make millions of dollars, or at least I haven't seen that yet. So basically, being able to work through this evidence. We also have capabilities. So, like, what are you going to need to pull this off? And then these themes. It's not a coincidence. I keep like going on about these themes. You have desirability, feasibility, and viability themes. So basically, you can kind of look at the list of experiments and say, my risk is, let's say, desirability. Well, which desirability experiments would I choose? And out of that, which ones are fast and don't cost much, right? Same thing with your further on. You're like, I want to test all three of these. Well, I know something like concierge can test all three, and we test feasibility backstage because we're literally just creating the thing by hand. Okay, we're testing some of desirability because we're interacting with the customers and they can give us feedback into whether this solves for the job or creates the need that they have. And then if you charge for it, right, you can also test for viability. Okay, so we really try to take that framing and make it really useful for everyone. All right, so what I thought we could do is I have, for those of you who don't have the book yet, I have like a cheat sheet to it. So shout out to Tendai Vicky. He's associate partner at Strategizer, and he and a designer helped create these little cards for us. They're not publicly available yet, but they're here in the mural board for us. And what I thought is I would paste this link in. You can click enter as visitor, so you don't have to create an account. I mean, they do have free accounts, but for today, we're just going to be creating stickies. So just click that link and you can join me here and just enter as visitor and you'll be like anonymous squirrel or snail or something that, yeah, I see some of you popping in at the bottom. All right. So as you all join, basically what I wanted to show is these are pretty much lightweight versions of the book. And so let's say you didn't know what like a day in the life is. All right. So if you scroll in here, you could see that, oh, okay, if I zoom in, oh, so you didn't get the link. Here you go. Everyone, here you go. There's a link for you. So basically, Okay, so you can zoom in. You can say, okay, because some of you are asking for resources, and I do want to make sure you have access to this. This will be up for about 30 days after our webinar together here. So basically, you can say, oh, day in the life. All right, that's discovery. It's more for exploration. And then for, okay, so day in the life is, it's basically, it's like follow me home, basically. It's like ethnographic research. It doesn't cost a lot. And the evidence strength is pretty good because it's real world. And it doesn't take long to run. Okay, this is something maybe we could do, all right? And so if you want to see even better version of that, you can literally double click on these, and these are PDFs. So these are in the board with you all, right? So you can zoom in and be like, okay, this is a little better resolution. So all 44 are here, but again, they don't tell you a lot about how to do it, and none of the case studies are attached because today we really, that would be overwhelming amount of information. So this is like a recipe card version of the book, all right, that we have here for you today. So let's say we want to do a sequence. All right. So while you guys check these out, while you're all looking at the experiments, I want to carry through a real study, and you all can tell me if there's something you want to work on, and we can spend a few moments doing that if you'd like to. So one of the projects I was around, which I thought was hilarious, but it was real, by the way, was a men's dating advice chatbot. Okay. So this was a real thing. It was a team out of New York. And it was like, hey, we're going to create a chatbot that gives people dating advice. All right. Well, they didn't start off with building the chatbot. What they started off with were customer interviews. So basically, they went out and interviewed men, like, how are you getting dating advice? What's confusing? Like, what are the jobs, pains, and gains of trying to get dating advice, basically. They also did some search trend analysis. So they basically looked online and said how many people are searching for this kind of topic. I like this because you can interview and get a little bit qualitative. So if you do like 15 to 20, but then when you jump in, you kind of want to know, is there a total, like, is there a market size for this? And is anybody else, is there observable evidence of people, seeking a solution? And usually search trend analysis is a great way to figure that out. After that, they did some paper prototyping. And so they started sketching out what the bot could do and showing it to customers. Then they spun up a landing page, right? So it kind of gave them the overall value prop for the for the chatbot. They also used discussion forums to promote that. So things like Hacker News and Reddit were really great for that. And then they did basically Wizard of Oz. So basically, the Wizard of Oz was, in this case, they hired. I can sketch this out a bit for you all. They hired. They had a team of 3 women. Okay, so like here they had some. They just basically had a team of 3 women, right? And they were trying to figure out. Let me move that over a bit for you all. They're trying to figure out, for their Wizard of Oz, they're trying to figure out, okay, would people respond to real requests? Like, what kind of requests would people send in, and would they could they provide value without building an entire bot, right? And so when you think about that, essentially what happened here was it's very interesting. So they had over 1,000 signups for for the bot in a few hours, right? So that wasn't great. And so when you think about your experimentation, think about you want to keep it small and targeted and focused on what you want to learn. And so kind of what happened here is that overwhelmed, right, the women, because there were only 3. And it, like, literally you could go to Hacker News and people were posting, oh my gosh, I'm so hopeless that the bot's ignoring me and won't even give me dating advice. So that was not the purpose of the experiment, right? And so instead, what they ended up doing was they made a wait list, right? And that kind of stemmed this whole overflow. And then they were able to really provide value to a smaller segment, and they were able to respond. And they all responded in like the same tone, basically as if they were a bot. And so what I thought was really interesting with this one is they used what they learned from the interviews to inform the search trend analysis. They used from that to inform the paper prototyping, that to inform the landing page, that to help figure out where to acquire customers. And then they went and basically, basically used the Wizard of Oz to start testing, testing the themes that we spoke about without building. And so if I zoom in a bit here, if we think of those three circles again, right? So we had our three circles. We had desirability, we had viability, and we had feasibility. Okay, desirability was like a go. I mean, they had 1,000 signups in a few hours. Like people wanted this. I guess men just take advice from bots. Like it doesn't matter. Like men need help dating, right? Feasibility was kind of a question mark because you would have to take all those requests and then use that to inform a bot, which you can do, but it's not necessarily trivial, right? And then viability was a big no. Like people weren't willing to pay for this. None of the price testing kind of worked out. There's probably a way to make a business model work with a chatbot like this. This was several years ago, so potentially now you could do something maybe more creative. But at the time, people did not want to pay for this whatsoever. And so, if I had met maybe like your traditional startup doing this, basically they would have built the bot right away. They would have basically just said, okay, we're going to build a bot. Let's raise $100 million for a chatbot and let's go see if people want it, build it and they will come approach. What I appreciate that's becoming more common now is let's experiment our way through this and learn and then figure out, okay, is this something we should invest in or not? And I think that's where a lot of these methods that we've picked up on for so many years can help. So what I thought would do, and we'll get to questions after this, is give you all a chance to kind of play with this. All right. So here's the link for the board. Those of you didn't have it. And so if you join here, you can create stickies. So I'm going to give you, give you like 5 minutes for this because we do want to get to some questions soon. So I'm going to play some music. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. I'll set a timer here. And what I want you to do is I want you to check out these experiments. And I know there's a lot here, but just kind of browse these experiments. Think of something you're working on. All right. And then what would be your sequence? Like what would be like your learning plan for figuring out what could help you pay down your risk? For this one, they went interviews to search trend to paper prototyping to landing page to discussion forums to Wizard of Oz. Doesn't mean that was the right flow. That was just the flow they chose. They could have the concierge, they could have done other things, right? But I want to give you all time to figure that out, all right? And just play with this a bit because I think that's how we learn, right? So I'm going to play some music. I'm going to put a timer up here for 5 minutes. And I want you all to use sticky notes. You can just double click and type in it. It's pretty straightforward. You don't have to do anything too like advanced here. And I'll give you some minutes to like look through this and see what you're working on. And then we can do some Q&A, all right? All right, so 5 minutes and go. Have about 2 more minutes left. Create your stickies. Have about 30 seconds left. All right, very, very cool. So, yeah, I'm just kind of browsing through these. We'll do Q&A here in a minute, and I love what you all were coming up with, right? Basically going from like interviews to trend analysis to an email campaign to a landing page. Yeah, that's a good flow. Also, you can even do a landing page to an email campaign in the sense of if you have a call to action with email, right? Then you can even follow it up with you can really start building your early adopter list. I also see some of my teams, they'll do interviews for people that signed up on the landing page, which I still see too many teams forget about. You know, like these are people that are organically coming and saying, oh, I want this thing, I'm willing to give it my email. Chances are they're probably willing to talk to you for about 15 minutes about it if you reach out to them. Some of the other ones I see here, working on a new course for healthcare, very cool. So day in the life, yeah, that's a big one because you can do interviews and then you can go observe, right? And try not to bias, right? Because you're just observing. I see that a lot in health tech. And then a brochure to an email campaign to a landing page to a clickable. Yeah, that's a good one. And then LOI, a letter of intent. Yeah, that's really great for B2B and for other ones where we're trying to say, well, you say you'll use this, but can you put it in writing, even though it's non-legally binding? And you'll notice some people will put it in writing and some people won't. And they're like, oh yeah, this is awesome, but I'm not putting it in writing. Or this is awesome. Oh great, can you write a letter of recommendation to your boss on how we should use this? And we're like, no, you're awesome, but no, I'm not writing that. So you start to see, even though it's light evidence, you start to understand directionally, am I on the right track? Are people like what they say and what they do? Can we close that gap? Link tracking, card sorting, yeah, some other ones right here. Some explainer video. I really love the storyboarding to explainer video combo because you can take what you've learned from the storyboards to inform your explainer video. Some WhatsApp stuff. Yeah, there's some really great stuff in here. Cool. Yeah. So basically what I'm trying to convey here is that don't think about just doing one experiment. Like very rarely is that enough. You're going to have to do multiple over time. And so how can you kind of select that like next best test to get the learning you need to feel a little more confident that you should invest in this, this idea and this business model? Okay. All right. So with that said, for those of you who have the board link, we're going to do some Q&A now. There's also, before we jump to that, if you scroll over here to the right, there's actually a masterclass I'm running next month with a discount code for you all. So if you just double click on that, that'll literally open it up for you. And so down here, I think, yeah, it's May 10th to 12th. We're doing a 3-day event here that's like 4 hours a day. It's pretty intense. So don't click on you have to click on the image, unfortunately. The text won't work, but the image, that'll bring up the event for you. So, okay, we covered a lot. I tend to do that in an hour. Dan, what kind of questions do we have rolling in here?
Yeah, David, thanks very much. We've got a number of questions, both from the chat as well as the ones that have been that have come through before that. So let me read out the first one. So this person asks, I've been using business model Canva. Currently, we have the marketing and engineering teams focus on desirability, the engineering and management focus on feasibility, and management and finance focus on viability. Is there a better way to organize those teams to build that business model canvas?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and I didn't touch on that earlier. So I'm actually going to jump back to here and try to answer it in a way that hopefully will help. So when I look at these 3 themes, right, you need folks in the room that can talk about each theme and that can help you address the risk in each theme, right? And so for business model canvas and these things, I tend to err on the side of being more inclusive. And so it's not perfect, but if you think about, let's say, and I've kind of had some sessions about this before, but if you say, desirability, right? So you're trying to ask this, do they, these do they questions. So your value prop and the customer segments, the jobs, pains and gains of them and everything. So quite often, I find that design plays a role in here. I find that marketing also does. Who else? Sales, user research, right? So it doesn't mean they have to have the specific role, but then if you think about who really will help you with those themes and help fill out, let's say like a canvas and help you go test, right? And give you perspective, because you're looking for observable evidence of proof for these assumptions, right? To support or not. For viability, it kind of varies a bit. Here's where I see product play more of a role, finance, right? Accounting, right? You need folks that can basically start pulling up. It's lagging a bit because we have so many, but basically product, finance, accounting. You have folks in here that will hopefully catch us up that can help with the viability questions that you have. And then on the backstage, when you think about feasibility, it's more about tech, but it could also be legal. It could be like safety and compliance, right? So when you think about it's less about, again, the exact roles, but you need to think about, do I have the right people in the room that can speak to kind of each theme of risk? And then, that overlaps nicely usually with the canvas, because you're trying to think, okay, like if I love designers, right? But I've had only designers in the room, we might actually neglect some of the other themes of risk or not have good answers for some of this other parts of the model. And therefore our risk is kind of skewed towards just what we know with the people in the room. And so I try to mix it up and have, they call it like cross-functional teams or balanced teams, right? You can always reach out beyond your team and get answers from them to help inform what you're doing. So yeah, it's not perfect, but I feel like you're going to need folks from each theme to kind of participate. Otherwise, if you just do it by yourself, it's really tough unless you're like a unicorn. It's really tough to answer all this.
A second question, David, for you. So what we'd like to know is, have you got any tips to close the gap between people who believe they have evidence for something and another set of people who don't trust it enough because the evidence can't be made available clearly?
Yeah, it's challenging, right? With biases, and evidence. I do think there's a lot more work to be done there. Like the book touched on it, and in our master classes we touch on it. But if you think about essentially, I think about like social sciences, right? If you think about confidence and should I be confident in something where I've only spoken to like 3 people? No, you shouldn't be, right? Like, and so some of it's just aligning on confidence with your team and like calibrating that. And then basically you want to say like, if this was my own money and I was investing in this, would I be like confident enough to invest in this? You know, and so you have to kind of change your mindset in the sense of when you think of evidence, you think observable evidence, like real world, right? That's qualitative and quantitative. And you don't want to extrapolate too far from like, oh, this worked over here, so it's going to work for us. You know, that's why all these Uber for X startups failed out here in the Valley was they thought, oh, that works for Uber, so that's going to work for like house cleaning and other stuff. And so they didn't really spend their time kind of like testing their way through it and understanding like, would this work for us? And so I think when you think of evidence, try not to outsource it all. Try to be able to generate it on your own if possible and have recent observable evidence, and then try to just kind of work your way through and get stronger evidence over time and kind of build the case for either doing this or not. And so I don't know if there's like one tip I would give you, but I say, you know, one of the reasons we have evidence and no evidence on that 2x2 now is because I used to have known and unknown. If you look at my old YouTube videos, you'll see those. And I had leaders who would just say, well, I just know. And they would stick it there, right? And then we had certain and uncertain. They're like, well, I'm just certain, so I'm going to stick it there. And finally, we went to have evidence and no evidence. When they say, well, I know, or I'm certain, I was like, okay, do you have any evidence to back that up? And they'd be like, well, no. I was like, okay, well, then it goes over here. You know? So Eric has some great tips in Lean Startup too, where it has to be actionable, accessible, auditable for your metrics, the 3 A's, I like to call them. So there are some ways you can approach it, but it takes time, and you're just going to have to be able to kind of like iterate your way through this and be like, well, let's go check. Let's go check to see if this is true or not. And so there's not like one thing I would point you to, but I would say, you know, just try to find your next best test over time and kind of generate your own evidence whenever possible.
Okay. So we've got a question about two-sided platforms. The question is asking this question, which is, I'm preparing a marketplace involving 2 audiences where there needs to be a critical mass for each to sort of chicken and egg problem. What are the best experiments to de-risk the assumption that the audience will use the marketplace? Because both landing pages and surveys have failed to provide insights to date for this person.
Yeah, that's tough. I did a video of that not too long ago. You know, what will probably work out for you is for one side doing something like a concierge. So I think this was probably a much longer conversation, right? But when it's hard to get critical mass on a marketplace for both sides right away. And everybody I've spoken to that's built marketplaces, it's taken them almost a year to figure out both sides, even with fast experimentation. So usually what happens is you kind of tailor your build to one side, and you have like a landing page and call to action kind of stuff for one audience, and the other audience you're concierging them on to the platform, and it's hand-holding kind of experience. That doesn't mean that always works, but I think concierge could potentially help you there. But I think getting beyond interviews or surveys and landing pages for sure, there has to be a real value exchange. So you have to think like, what's the thinnest slice of this platform where I can have people interacting with, and then can I build off from there? But if you're just trying to get like critical mass on both sides and then do it, it's going to be really, really tough. And so I think concierge could potentially help. Just pick a side and concierge it, while the other side is a little more, you know, self-service. Could potentially work.
Right. So one of our audience wants to know more about male dating chatbot, particularly around the question of how did the team identify customers or potential customers for each experiment, and were the same set of customers used throughout for all the experiments?
No, it wasn't the same set of customers. We used to have a white paper on it. I'll have to find it. I don't know if it's online anymore. But this product actually topped Product Hunt one day. You might be able to find it on Product Hunt somewhere. That's a site where people go to rank and basically hunt new products and upvote, downvote, and comment on them. I don't remember all the exact details, but basically they didn't use the same group throughout the whole thing. It was more of this was like when chatbots were becoming all the craze, right? And it was like, well, maybe we can do dating advice through that. And would it be viable and, you know, desirable and feasible? And so what happened was it was very desirable like again, 1,000 signups the first day, but it wasn't necessarily viable, and it was kind of feasible. I know the tech they chose, again, this was several years ago, so they were using like Twilio, and basically had a landing page with a phone number you would type in and then go, and it would send the messages, and they could like respond back through text and SMS. You could do many different tech stacks for this, but basically, yeah, it was. I would say it was really fun. I know the founders now, so people that worked on this project by chance, they're also creating startups now that are doing this for other things. So like advice for parents on buying things for their infants, for like car seats and stuff. So what they learned from this experience, even though it failed, they're using in other successful startups, which I think is amazing. Which happens sometimes, right? It doesn't. Everything's not a success, and so you can take that what you learn and hopefully apply it elsewhere.
Okay. So this is a question about when you've got conflicting views within a team about what is important, and also what about the quality of the evidence. If people aren't agreeing about those two dimensions, how do you proceed?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack for that one. I would say you need some sort of alignment, even though if there's healthy conflict with those three main kind of leaders, right? So if you think desirability, viability, feasibility, that's also again a balanced team, you could say, or leaders in your org that come together to see a balanced view of risk. They're going to have to work it out. Now, why I like them all in the same room is it's relative, right? So like if you can't build the tech whatsoever, it kind of doesn't matter if people want it. And or if you can build the tech and you can build it and execute it, but you'd have no data on whether people want it or not, that becomes biggest. So I don't have a great like one word or sentence answer for that, other than I have found when you get people in the room and do this, maybe it's just the way I facilitate, it doesn't end up being a big deal. Like, yeah, there's some healthy debate, but eventually it's like, we're going to be wrong. It's just like, how wrong are we? And let's go test and find out. So these maps, when I zoom in here, right, these maps, they are very much iterative and kind of like your snapshot of what you know now. And there's a good chance you've got it wrong. And so when you go off and experiment, you're coming back and updating this. And so the teams I work with, right, they'll run experiments, they'll update their map, they'll come back and update their canvas, right? So these two artifacts here are updated pretty frequently. And so you can like stay in a conference room or on a Zoom call and argue with each other, but we don't even know who's right until you go off and actually like run more experiments. So I would say try to not get hung up in like the circular debates and try to say, okay, let's go off and run experiments and then use that to inform this conversation. I don't know if it's like I'm right, you're wrong kind of conversation is going to get very far.